session are noted for their expertise in building the kind of interdisciplinary bridges that make such an effort possible. Following the three presentations of our speakers, questions will be posed to our panelists, which have been submitted by our audience members via the Q&A portal, which you can find at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please submit your questions as they occur to you so that I can pose them to our panelists at the end of their sessions. So let us now turn to our speakers. Our first speaker is Antonio Alejo, who is a collaborator at the research group on societies in motion at the University of A Coruña in Spain. In addition, is the research associate at the Instituto Galego de Análise y Documentación Internacional in Galicia. Dr. Alejo's research analyzes contemporary diplomacy's transformations beyond state-centric perspectives, with a transdisciplinary dialogue between global studies, including sociology and urban governance, critical diplomatic studies, human mobility, and nomadic thinking. He is the author of Activismos Transnacionales de México, Diálogos Interdisciplinares ante la Política Global, published by Instituto Mora in 2018. He is also the author of the very important article, Migrant Diplomacies, Rethinking Diplomacy Beyond State-Centric Perspectives. Antonio joins us today from A Coruña. Welcome, Antonio.
Oh, thank you, David. Well, first of all, I want to start giving the thanks to David Arnoy for having me here. So let me start my presentation. In this table, I have to read my presentation, so I have to be there, but I have to read it. So first, hello everyone. I thank David Arnoy for having me on this panel. It is an honor and exciting to be part of this conference organized by the School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University. Following the guiding questions prepared for this panel on diplomacy, migration, and vulnerability, I will try to reflect on the most profitable strategies among stakeholders to address the environmental challenge. I start. The world is witnessing an alarming outbreak of weather disasters. There can be little doubt that this only be the beginning of the grim toll that the environmental crisis will take in the years ahead. People have been forced from their homes because of increasing insecurities and violent conflict. However, another crisis looms close. Through both slow onset and sudden environmental impacts like volcanic eruption, earthquakes, droughts, floods, cyclones, hurricanes, and wildfires, the environmental crisis has caused over 3.7 million new displacements in 2020. Environmental challenge induced human mobilities, such as migration, forced displacements, or planned retreat location, are almost always projected as an issue of the future. But the environmental crisis is no longer a futuristic threat. Despite evolving research, there is a gap in directly connecting human mobility to impacts of environmental challenge. Evidence shows that areas of the world are becoming less habitable due to the sudden and slow onset climate-related hazards. However, directly attributing human mobility to impacts of the environmental crisis remains difficult. So, how do you have to think and apply diplomacy before global human mobility and environmental crisis? In 2018, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration recognized that migration in the context of environmental degradation and climate change is a reality and makes commitment to support both migrants and states. In the face of this opportunity, a network perspective on diplomacy is needed to involve environmental migrants that suffer the consequences of global environment challenge. Traditional diplomacy has become an increasingly intriguing and crowded, if not overcrowded, field of research as seen in academic literature's flourishing expansion. For example, I can argue with Kana that traditional diplomacy models hold only one lesson. They are insufficient to manage the current global challenge. In international relations literature, there are significant efforts to develop approaches to study the participation of civic actors in multilateral organizations and global governance. However, researching the relationship between diplomacy and civic actors is a study area of diplomatic studies. One of the issues is the growing presence of migrant organizations that demand formal spaces or mechanisms to be involved in global human mobility agenda decision-making processes. Consequently, it is possible to show evidence of how Ministers of Foreign Affairs, multilateral organizations, or global summits are adapting their infrastructures to make room to formal participations by migrant organizations, presenting vocal demands for accountability and more transparency on the part of multilateral institutions and state international commitments. According to Heine, diplomacy is transforming from club, emphasizing interstate dynamics and national interests, to network diplomacy, more complex and less hierarchical. This transformation mirrors the opening of the black box of the nation state as NGOs, among other actors, link up with their own pairs across the world, giving a further impetus to transnational relations. For Ashworth, this transformation process is an example of a unique coalition of government, civil society, and international groups working closely together to bring about significant change. With this idea in mind, I contend that traditional diplomacy is confronted with pressures to democratize the world order. However, following Constantino, this claim is not new in discussion on diplomacy. Historically, there is clear evidence of a long tradition of stakeholders as experts partaking in deliberation on international issues. In this sense, the traditional perspective on diplomacy holds that consulting experts is a legitimate expression of the democratic qualities of the state's interest. In my view, this kind of consultation has tended to lack democratic components. They have been informal, close, and opaque. Current claims are inserted in a complex web of diachronic and synchronic challenge to observe institutions, practices, administration, and theories of diplomacy in contemporary global politics. Indeed, foreign policy and diplomacy develop their own transformations. Closer to the view of network diplomacy, Ashworth holds that diplomacy today requires expanding networks of communications and forging new kinds of partnership. We are referring to the rise of soft power and the growing influence of civil society groups in foreign affairs. But let me share with you this report from the BBC as an experience about the Haitian people in their journey from South America to North America. I think this part is important to rethink how we observe this network diplomacy. So let me share with you this report. A few weeks ago, approximately 30,000 would-be migrants gathered under a bridge connecting Del Rio in Texas with Ciudad Acuña in Mexico. Many of the migrants are fleeing natural disasters, poverty, and political turmoil, and making a 3 hours journey through Latin America to reach the border. While citizens of several countries are represented in the migrant camp in Del Rio, including Dominicans, Venezuelans, and Cubans, the vast majority are from Haiti. Of the Haitians, a significant number fled after a devastating earthquake struck the country in 2010 and took up residence in Brazil and other South American countries. Haiti has also suffered from years of political instability, culminating in the assassination of President Jovenel Moise in July. The following months, the country suffered another deadly earthquake. Tatiana Anglade, the Haitian Board Development and Operation Director of the Washington-based Lambie Fund of Haiti, says the combination of natural disasters and political unrest over the years had left many Haitians with nothing to hold on to. There was a big lack of hope for the people who were living on the ground on Haiti, she says. It just been one shock after another, and one trauma after another. Many of the Haitians at the US-Mexico border experienced a long and a difficult journey from South America. Paul Thomas Saint, a journalist for the Haitian news outlet Able Post, who visited Rio to collect testimonies from migrants, says most migrants had a sad story from the journey. Many women were raped during the trip, and many people died, he says. You have the thieves and gangs along the route, and people they have to pay to take them from one point to another. Experiences of Filoreston Jambier, a Haitian man currently in the Mexican border town of Mexicali, are typically of many of the migrants at the border. Like many of his countrymen who had been in Del Rio, Mr. Jambier first spent several years in Brazil before moving to Chile. There, he met his wife and has a child, who is now 3 years old. But as they were unable to move beyond the lowest social rung in South America, the Jambier family decided to head north to the US. They said, "We have been through 11 different countries to get here," Mr. Jambai told, describing an extraordinary journey on foot and by bus across the Andes and the Amazonian basin. The trip was often dangerous, in the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama, for example. He says he saw the dead bodies of migrants. He also describes being robbed by bandits and says many of the women were raped. In August, his mother was among the 2,200 people who lost their lives in Haiti's earthquakes, in which his father lost a leg. "I had to keep going. My father has no one now, and the only person who can send him money is my brother in the US," he says, "and I need to help too." A significant number of Haitians at the borders originally had been in Brazil, attracted by the promise of plentiful jobs during 2016 Summer Olympic and 2014 World Cup. When those jobs dried up, many began heading to other countries in Latin America. After Brazil, many Haitians went to Chile. There were opportunities in the construction sector there too. Mr. Thomas explains, at the time, it was very easy to them go there. They didn't need visas. But many Haitians subsequently left Chile, driven away by increasingly strict migration policies. From South America, the Haitians head north to the US under the false assumption, sometimes followed by rumors, that they will be welcome there. The people who we have at the US border are the ones who left 5, 6, or 7 years ago. Mr. Thomas says, many of them just couldn't find jobs anymore. Ms. Anglade says many head towards the US after hearing that the door will be open to them if they arrive at the port of entry. They thought that they had as long as they make in the border. They have a better opportunity, she says. But when they walk into as a deplorable situation, there are no words to explain or express how painful it is watching what those people are going through under that bridge. I try to reflect on the most profitable strategies among stakeholders to address the environmental challenge. I conclude that network diplomacy is a virtuous along 2 dimensions for the global environmental context. First, I strengthen democratic ideals of constructing environmental policies with the inclusion of environmental migrant organizations. Second, it helps champion principles of multilateralism by abounding the domination of narrow political and economic elites that have decided exclusively about the content of agendas in global politics while ignoring the views of significant sectors affected by these processes. Finally, I contend that network diplomacy is needed more than ever in today's global political climate of high uncertainty, protectionism, nationalisms, and xenophobia, coupled with increasing socioeconomic inequalities and crisis for the Western idea of liberal democracy. In this struggle, environmental migrant organizations play a significant role, demanding thinking about new strategies for diversifying and broadening their scope and ambitions to reach deeper and further in multilateral and global environmental issues. In the future, it will be interesting to follow the pushing of boundaries as to how far network diplomacy may actually transform mainstream diplomacy, so it becomes an integral part unless lumped together with new diplomacies in the face of global human mobility and the global environmental crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for mapping out a number of different topics that I know we are going to pursue in the course of this conversation. So now, let us turn now to our second speaker of the panel, and that is Shailja Sharma. Shailja is professor and chair of the Department of International Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. She's also the founder of the Refugee and Forced Migration Program at DePaul. Her research interests include post-colonial theory and literature, Migration and Diaspora, South Asia, Citizenship Studies, Race, Forced Migration, and Displacement. She was a Fulbright Fellow in India in 2018 to 2019, working on a project on violence, memory, and citizenship. She is the author of Post-Colonial Minorities in Britain and France, in the Hyphen of the Nation State, published by Manchester in 2016, and she's also the editor of New Cosmopolitanisms, South Asians in the United States, published by Stanford University in 2006. Professor Sharma joins us today from Chicago. Welcome, Shailja.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. This is such a great set of panelists and speakers. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share a PowerPoint just to have us look at something, while I'm talking. And it has some, information as well. So I'm going to try and share this. So I'm going to focus in my talk on looking at what are called climate change refugees. It's a category that's very contested. They are not really seen to be refugees, but migrants, and there are not a lot of laws, international laws at least, that give protection to climate change migrants, even as climate change mobility is becoming a bigger and bigger issues. And climate change and degradation is actually one of the big drivers of displacement in the world right now. This occurs directly due to disasters such as floods, hurricanes, but also indirectly through food insecurity, loss of arable land, to salination, falling water tables. And as a result of all these factors, there's increased conflict that drives human mobility. So the IOM, actually estimates as of June that by 2050, so less than 30 years from now, there will be about 250 million people who will be displaced by climate change. Which is almost 4 times the current number of migrants. However, the problem, I think, is that the current laws for protecting displaced people do not cover those who are displaced due to climate change. So a lot of these people are displaced internally, so within national borders, and some of them cross international borders and are displaced internationally. Internally, about 143 million internal climate migrants in the world by 2050. So these are really large and unfathomable numbers in some sense. So I wanted to really sort of get into this question of, what are some of the diplomatic efforts around trying to figure out how to protect people? Is something being done at a large international level, or is it just sort of piecemeal at national levels? So currently, people who are classified as refugees are really those who can prove that they were displaced due to conflict, that they are being persecuted. A lot of the big stories about displacement in the media are about Syria, about Afghanistan, and people from there coming to the global north. But actually, if you look at, where people are going, you can see that the sending and receiving countries, the top countries from which people are displaced, so almost 68% of totally of people who are displaced worldwide are from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And the receiving countries are all in the global south, except for the case of Germany, which was a one-time sort of exception. But most of them, about almost 90% of people who are displaced are actually hosted in developing countries, most of them in neighboring countries, because people actually don't want to travel very far when they are displaced. They want to go close by so that they can go back home when situations change. So as you look at this list, what you're going to see is you're going to see immediate causes of displacement, and you're also going to think about what are some of the cumulative long-term causes of displacement. Because in a lot of countries like Syria, like Afghanistan, like Myanmar, conflict is fueled by climate change and environmental degradation. So, but people actually can't get protected as a result of that. So environmental migration can take many complex forms. It can be forced, it can be voluntary, it can be temporary or permanent, internal, international, individual, collective, proximate, or long distance. The nature, the duration, and the scale of environmental migration depends also on whether it takes place as a result of slow onset events, right? So we're talking about slow onset events like sea level rises, increasing temperatures, land degradation, or sudden onset events like disasters, floods, cyclones, storms, etc., that are exacerbated by environmental degradation. So there are many hidden environmental causes of human mobility, as I've been trying to lay out. So here is the definition of an environmental migrant by the International Organization on Migration. They say environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment that adversely affects their lives or living conditions are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so, forced or voluntary, either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad. So you can see this is a very broad definition. It opens the door to thinking about a lot of conventional migration as environment-fueled migration. Here are some examples of direct causes, such as disasters, and then hidden environmental causes. And often the slow onset causes can actually result in conflict. When it results in conflict and people leave cross international borders, they can actually ask for protection under normal refugee law. But if there is no conflict and they are fleeing because of dwindling resources, there are not a lot of countries who will give them refugee status or protection in any way. So what I wanted to do today was look at what kinds of international compacts, laws, are there globally to protect people who are fleeing climate change or due to environmental causes. So even though we've known about climate change for a very long time, actually, in international diplomatic circles, work on creating laws for protection of climate migrants starts not very long ago, about 10 years ago, with the Cancun Adaptation Framework, which introduces language about climate change, induced displacement, and planned relocation. So that's the first time in an international context we start talking about the fact that this is going to be a big problem. The biggest set of guidelines that we've got is from what's called the Nansen Initiative, which took 3 years to put together, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then after that, in 2015 and 2016, we've had, more and more discussion about what's the responsibility of states and other organizations to create a framework within which climate migrants can be protected. So the definition of a classic refugee, if you will, or a traditional refugee, according to the 1951 Convention, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So these 5 factors plus persecution, these are the things that you have to show if you apply for refugee status in crossing international borders. Nowhere in this do we see a mention of climate or environmental degradation or inability to earn a livelihood. And, so none of the things that I've been mentioning up till now actually would allow you, if you were crossing international borders, to actually get refugee status. In cases when climate change produces conflict, yes, then you can ask for refugee status, but not otherwise. So states have to create different forms of protection for people who are fleeing as a result of environmental degradation. Who is going to provide them? How? Under which laws? So when states got together in 2012 to start working on the Nansen Initiative, there was a lot of discussion about who would be the people involved in coming up with new guidelines. And there was some talk at that time of having, NGOs, academics, think tanks, involved because of their expertise or because they've been working at the grassroots level with climate migrants and so on. And there was a huge pushback from states. They were very clear that they did not want non-state actors involved in setting up the guidelines. In fact, this was a big debate at that time. And eventually, what happened is that the UN created a group with a diplomat lawyer at the head, Walter Kalin, and he managed to work with almost 109 states to come up with some of the guidelines that we get in the Nansen initiative. So I think that is a very interesting sort of example of where diplomacy sought to be expanded beyond the parameters of states, and states see themselves as sort of the primary actors and assert control over the process. So right now, I think diplomatically and internationally, we are at the state where we are still creating commonly understood definitions for people who are fleeing because of climate change. And it is in very small incremental steps. Even states are trying to understand, like what are the ways in which climate change drives displacement, who will flee as a result of that, what are the projections, where will they flee, and what are the needs of the states who will then receive these people, and what do they get out of it? So, I mean, this is sort of brass tacks diplomacy, like if we take in these people, what's in it for us, right? So there was this insistence on state-led and state-defined protection keeps coming up against the insistence of the states that this is a never-ending problem and they don't want to be involved. There are some exceptions. The Scandinavian states have said that they would be open to an international compact on climate fuel migration. But one of the leaders in this is actually a small nation in the Pacific called New Zealand, that you might have heard of. And they are looking at the area around them of Pacific Islands, who are one of the sort of major at-risk countries who risk rising sea levels, and literally their countries will disappear under the sea. And so they are looking at New Zealand, and New Zealand is trying to come up with some sort of human rights-based approach, which sees that it's not just state protection or state persecution that can create refugees, but they also seen the importance of creating other migration pathways in a very targeted way. So some of the ways in which New Zealand has been discussing how this can take place is to do some kind of preemptive voluntary migration schemes, right? What does that mean? It means that they will create migration pathways for people to come to New Zealand in a limited but organized way from these Pacific Island countries. Some of the ways in which they can do that is by building on IDP laws. IDPs are internally displaced people, and the UN already has some laws in place and guidelines protecting IDPs. So one of the things that New Zealand is doing is looking at IDP law and translating that into a way of protecting climate fuel mobility. They're also trying to create seasonal and agricultural labor jobs. So New Zealand, as you know, is a mostly agricultural country. They also have a viticulture, economy. So one of the ways in which they're allowing, migration is through seasonal labor, where people can come, work for say 6 months, and then go back, which allows them to sort of understand what life in New Zealand is like, and then decide if they actually want to come there. And it's also a win-win for New Zealand because they have a shortage of labor, and the agricultural industry can profit from that. Eventually, they hope that they can scale this up. The other thing they are doing is targeting certain professions and saying, that we will allow certain professionals to come to our countries and we will train them to work in our country. One such scheme is called the Kiribati Nursing Initiative. So they have a shortage of nurses, and they are hoping that through this they can address skill shortages, but also then build on these small scale programs and increase protection as well. And I think this is a sort of good model to look at in thinking about what countries can do. So a couple more things, thinking in terms of strategies, which is what David encouraged us to do, is use processes like the Nansen Initiative to increase collaboration among advocacy organization, and even when they can't be formally involved in the process of creating laws, maybe to create the position of sort of experts who can give their input at certain points in the process of creating these laws. And then look at neighboring laws. So if environmental migrants cannot be protected under refugee law, are there other forms of displacement law out there that can be adapted to climate change migration? And work with resettlement agencies, work with corporations. These are all actors that can be useful in thinking about the future. So in terms of my own work, I will say that, as the founding director of Refugee and Forced Migration Studies, a lot of my work has been public facing, and I've learned a lot in sharing what the program aims to do, what it hopes to do, in places like churches, on radio programs, on television programs, talking with potential students, talking with their parents. And one of the things that I've learned is there is no bad venue and there's no bad dialogue. So as a practitioner and as a scholar, you need to talk to a lot of people. And that is the only form of diplomacy that I can see working right now in terms of addressing the crisis, in terms of raising, awareness, but also bringing, different perspectives to bear on the issue, not just academic or legal ones. And when I talk to my students in particular, I can see that they are very, very aware of these crises, and they see their future sort of imperiled by climate change. We don't need to convince them, but we do need to hear from them what they think are the tools they can use in order to build a better world. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shailja. You really offered a very nuanced consideration of a number of different themes that I hope that we pursue as this conversation goes forward. And on that theme, I just want to call attention to the audience to our Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And please submit your questions that I will be very looking forward to sharing with our panelists at the end of these three presentations. So speaking of which, we're now going to move on to our third presenter, Karlos Perez de Armiño. Karlos is an associate professor of international relations at the University of the Basque Country in Bilbao, Spain. He is a principal investigator of the research group on human security, local human development, and international cooperation at the Hagoa Institute. His research engages complex political emergencies, humanitarian action, food security, including starvation and conflicts, human security, post-war rehabilitation, and peace building in Mozambique, Angola, and most recently in Colombia. He is the author of several books and multiple articles, including the article Ethical Debates on Global Hunger, Moral Obligations to the Distant Other and Global Justice, in Leira Escajedo's edited volume entitled Ethics of Charitable Food, Dilemmas for Policy and Practice, published by Springer this year in 2021. Professor Perez de Armiño joins us today from Bilbao. Welcome, Karlos.
Thank you very much, David, and also Noé Cornago, my university colleague, and the rest of the organizers for the invitation. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to participate in this important conference. In my intervention, I would like to share with you some reflections on the impact of climate change as a cause of human migration, and more specifically on some needs and challenges of the international response that is necessary, especially from the transprofessional perspective mentioned in the title of this conference. So I would like basically to focus on three ideas. The first one is, as a starting point, to emphasize that there is an increasing close relationship between environmental problems and migration. The second, that many interventions can be implemented to prevent or to mitigate climate change and population displacement. And the third one is that these interventions require the involvement of many different organizations as well as different professional profiles. This is necessary, but I think the most interesting point is that it also presents difficulties because they are different organizations, different languages, different experiences. And well, I would like to explore a little bit these challenges. So the first idea, as I said, is that a large part of human migration, both internal and international, is closely associated with environmental problems. There is a growing evidence of this relationship. For example, it's estimated that at least 31 million people were displaced last year as a result of natural disasters. And moreover, studies say that the problem will grow in the future. A recent World Bank report warns that by 2050, the number of internally displaced people could reach 143 million, largely due to climate change. In analyzing the environmental causes of migration, we must take into account at least two dimensions, as both can motivate displacement. On the one hand, we have to analyze the sudden onset disasters, which are shaped by hazards, for example, floods, hurricanes, droughts, and so on, and also by a given context of vulnerability, poverty, lack of resources, of infrastructures, and so on. On the other hand, the slow onset effects of climate change, which give rise to a progressive increase in vulnerability until this becomes so difficult, that so high that people decide to leave their homes. So among these effects of climate change, we could mention, for example, desertification, which affects at least 630 million people in all continents. It not only reduces agricultural and livestock production, but also the quantity and quality of water, which affects health and sanitation. Also, the increase in global temperature, which reduces agricultural production. For example, the increase of 1 Celsius degree reduces global wheat production by 6%. Or the sea level rise, which is going to be of between 30 centimeters and 1 meter by the end of the century. In many parts of the world, coastal zones with low elevation are densely populated. It's estimated, for example, that half a meter rise in Alexandria, Egypt, would displace 2 million people. So it's very important to emphasize that all these factors do not act alone. This means that the intensity of their impact depends very much on socioeconomic dimensions, for example, poverty, health status, gender, and also political dimensions, as public policies, respect for human rights, and so on. In short, the combination of these factors, both environmental and human ones, generates different triggers for the displacement of people when they see that their living conditions are seriously threatened, often giving rise to what we call humanitarian crisis. Among these triggers, we can highlight the loss of land, the erosion of livelihoods, food and water scarcity, deterioration of health and sanitation conditions, the loss of housing, or increased insecurity. There are many aspects that interrelate with each other, giving rise to real complex situations. The second idea I would like to emphasize is that there are many things that we can do to prevent or mitigate climate change and to manage the displacements of people caused by climate change. There are actions that have an impact at the international or national or local level. And therefore, they can be carried out by all kinds of actors, from United Nations agencies and international organizations to governments and local communities as well. Given this, that these are very complex situations with many interrelated factors, interventions must be multidimensional, involving professionals from many different fields. Some of these actions should be oriented to mitigate in the short term, while others should be oriented to prevent in the longer term. And among them, we could mention the following ones. First, of course, and it's quite obvious, mitigating the effects of climate change. Obviously, starting with a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The second type of interventions would be to avoid displacement in the short term, for example, as disaster risk reduction plans or climate change adaptation strategies. In this field, sophisticated technologies are being developed for this kind of interventions. For example, early warning systems, models to anticipate climate change, etc. And also, for example, the use of more drought-resistant seeds. So there are many scientific fields that can contribute. For example, environmental sciences, statistics, agronomy, and so on. However, sometimes the key lies not in new technologies, but in traditional practices or coping strategies that communities have implemented throughout history. For example, crop diversification, or sustainable water and land management, or community solidarity using social networks, social capital, and so on. So anthropology and development studies, for example, are helping to understand their importance in coping with this crisis. A third type of interventions should be oriented to promote socioeconomic development, to reduce vulnerability of families and increase their capacity to cope, to face the effects of climate change. And a fourth kind of action concerns the prevention of conflicts linked to climate change and peace building. The resource scarcity exacerbated by drought and desertification, for example, contributes to inter-community conflicts and population displacement. Well, the third idea I would like to elaborate a little bit is that the response to climate migration, which is multidimensional and complex, a complex phenomenon, requires the mobilization of multiple actors with different professional profiles, but this poses challenges and dilemmas. As we have seen, the problem requires action by different organizations. It also needs the involvement of professionals in different fields. As we have seen, we need professionals in the natural sciences able to analyze climate change, as well as experts in new technologies for the use of satellites or mathematical models and so on. Also specialists in health, water, sanitation, ecology. But however, a technical approach to the problem, I think, is not enough. It's necessary to have professionals who know how to analyze and address the specific conditions of each context of socio-economic vulnerability, such as, for example, sociologists, anthropologists, or even peace and conflict specialists. To sum up, there is a need to combine different professionals' profiles, but this poses, as I said, several difficulties and challenges, as they have different ways of approaching reality, different language, different working cultures or mechanisms. And well, I would like to mention a little bit some of these challenges. The first is that there is a tendency to give more relevance to technical explanations and solutions. For example, new seeds in the face of food insecurity. Paying less attention to the dimensions of socioeconomic vulnerability, bad governance, and so on. Two explanations come to mind. One is that the technical solutions are linked to patents, to new industrial products, and therefore to economic interests. And the other is that technical explanations and solutions somehow depoliticize the problem, they avoid looking for responsibilities among governments, companies, or policies or development models. The second challenge I would like to refer to is that actions must combine a double level, humanitarian aid or emergency response in the short term, and development cooperation for socioeconomic development in the long term. However, the link between humanitarian aid and development cooperation is not easy at all, as they have many differences. Each of these areas has its specialized organizations with different objectives, skills, working mechanisms, and as well as professionals with different profiles. In addition, humanitarian aid is based on certain legal frameworks, for example, in international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and also some humanitarian principles, as for example, independence, neutrality, impartiality, which are not applicable to development cooperation. A third difficulty or challenge is the relationship between international actors, such as United Nations agencies and large NGOs, and local actors, governments, associations, communities, and so on. Traditionally, the relationship has been quite hierarchical, with donors largely setting the conditions. But this is changing. For example, development cooperation talks about the need of local ownership, and humanitarian aid is talking more and more about the localization of aid, meaning that local actors should be much more involved in the planning and implementation of aid. These trends pose a crucial challenge to the international aid system as we have known it today. It implies that international staff, diplomats, United Nations officials, NGOs specialists, and so on, have to dialogue and work with local staff and communities. And this requires to adjust different skills, knowledge, cultures, values, work patterns, leaderships, and so on. It also implies a shift in power relations with a transfer of responsibilities from rich donor countries to southern societies. Another difficulty lies in the civilian-military relationship, especially in humanitarian crisis contexts. Since the end of the Cold War, military involvement in humanitarian crisis responses has increased. But the humanitarian sector says that these activities cannot be considered as humanitarian aid because they do not comply with the principles of independence, neutrality, and impartiality. Although sometimes they can make an unnecessary contribution to aid, for example, in the fields of logistics or transport. This is a relationship with certain tensions, although the Oslo guidelines of 1994 try to regulate them, giving the leadership and the priority in this context to humanitarian organizations. Well, in conclusion, as we have seen, mitigating the impact of climate change as a cause of human migration requires a cross-professional collaboration between organizations and specialists in different fields who, despite the difficulties, have to share their analytical skills and working mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for such a thoughtful and engaging presentation. I really appreciated you bringing up a number of categories that I think are very germane to our gathering, among them the pluralization of diplomacy, and the importance of interdisciplinary contributions to addressing climate change diplomatically, and then, of course, the last theme that you touched on regarding power. And so with that in mind, I have a question that I would like to pose to all three panelists. And I would ask if you would be so kind as to respond to this question in the order that you appeared. So Antonio, Shailja, and then Karlos. And my question is this: what do you think are the most fruitful strategies for helping people to make the connection between environmental degradation and the increase in human migration? It strikes me that, in a lot of public discourse, we find, of course, many political leaders who are leveraging the fear of migrants coming to their country for their own political power. And it strikes me that people are focusing on the end result of a very long process that begins with climate change and with environmental degradation and results in people having to move. And I'm just wondering, how do you think that diplomacy can be used, whether it be by state-sponsored actors, non-state actors, grassroots participants? How can diplomacy be used in a way that we can message this very clear connection between these two phenomena?
I start, right? I'm going to go first. Well, I think, like I tried to expose in my presentation, for me, the kind of diplomacy that we need to rethink regarding migrant people, exactly in this band with migrant associated with climate change or environmental crisis. I think the important is to think how the migrants are thinking their life in motion. And I think that unfortunately, I think many perspectives on diplomacy, they have some kind of thinking, some kind of territorial and sedentary thinking, and they are not thinking much about how the people in motions are living their daily lives. So for me, it's very important that at global or local level, it's necessary to observe what are the most the most important experiences that the migrants, refugee people, displacement people are living when I live in one place and are trying to go to another. So for me, I believe that the key idea is to put the focus on the people, not exactly on the states, not certain institutions, not exactly on the global north or south global perspectives, because I think that the most important is to think how the migrant people is thinking, why are they moving, how are they moving, and whether the connection or translocal connection that they have with the places where they live and the places where they are arriving. So I put the focus on the people in motion to understand, to get a better diplomacy more than in national interest or elite interest. And I think the important is to think where these people is moving. That's it. Thank you.
Shailja, would you mind taking that question on?
I think I can, think about like two ways in which, we can work to highlight this issue. And one is, to make the link between the environment and migration clearer. I think the media and then a lot of people tend to look at the absolute sort of proximate cause, what's the immediate cause of people moving, and forget to look at some of the systemic and hidden causes of people living. So for example, there are a lot of people from the region of Africa called the Sahel, right? Trying to get to the southern coast of Europe, Spain, Italy, etc., which I'm sure my other panelists know much more about. And the Sahel is one of the most vulnerable areas of climate change. Temperatures there are predicted to rise almost 3 degrees in the near future, and in an area where people herd livestock. Right, so there's no grass for livestock, so they face hunger and poverty, and so they flee to Europe. But the discourse about them is that they're economic migrants. Yes, they are economic migrants, but what's pushing them to Europe is the environment. But so one of the things we can do is make those connections much clearer. And the second is to really, push to create more. If states want to be in charge of migration, then states have to get more involved in creating these pathways for people to get there. And I don't think that those connections are made very often, especially in the US, where resettlement is almost exclusively run by nonprofits. and church groups. So just putting that out there.
Thank you so much, Shailja. Karlos.
Yes, thank you, David. Well, maybe I would mention again two concepts that I refer to in my presentation, which are local ownership and localization, both used in international aid, increasingly used. So I think that an important strategy would be going deeper into this in the implementation of these concepts or criteria. So transferring more power, more capacity to decide, to implement, and so on to local communities. And this is important also because some local communities are really important regarding the preservation of nature and natural resources. And I am, as you, David, said, I am working lately basically on peace building in Colombia, and very often with indigenous communities in the Cauca area, which is one of the most conflictual areas in Colombia, and with a high percentage of indigenous population. And you can see that to what extent indigenous people are extremely important in preserving natural resources. They have another way of thinking about nature, about agriculture, about how to use natural resources in a more respectful way than the modern agriculture. So indigenous there and in many places in the world can be seen as communities preserving natural resources. So we can learn a lot of things from them, regarding the preservation of environment. So to support their struggle for the control of their territories, for their autonomy, for their rights, I think is it would be a very important strategy, not only in terms of human rights or avoiding conflicts, but also in terms of preserving environment. But of course, this way of underlying, supporting local needs, local interests, local struggles should be combined also with a global perspective. Local struggles should be connected with global struggles, global objectives, and themselves, for example, indigenous people are very active in creating transnational, trans-American networks with their organizations, for example. Well, these are some of the ideas I would mention.
Thank
you so much, Karlos. Shailja, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I had a question for Karlos because, I'm from India, and in India there are, as he mentions, a lot of sort of local initiatives to keep traditional ways of conserving water and conserving farmland and so on and so forth. But that always comes up against, development policies that are designed to bring people into, the global sort of supply chain and mechanization and all these sort of development themed kind of practices. And there are more incentives and subsidies for doing that than there are for keeping traditional practices alive. So I think my question to Karlos is, if development is thought of as a way of sort of modernization, then how do societies and areas and cultures and groups actually work to keep traditional practices alive?
Well, that's a very important point. And sometimes talking about these issues in Colombia, I was in the context or that I had to confront people denying the concept development. And well, I think this is respectful, but we shouldn't identify development with modernization or with economic, macroeconomic growth or this kind of things. This is the traditional thinking about development, but there are other ways of approaching the issue: human development, sustainable development. So, well, I personally use the concept and I accept it, but in a critical way. And so the point is that, if, as you said, not only in India, but everywhere, with very few exceptions, most of development policies, for example, if we think about agriculture, they are focused on modern agriculture, monocultives for exportation and so on, for markets. But there are other models. I mean, other models producing different products, many different products for local markets in a respectful way. I mean, respecting land and their land's capacity to produce and so on. And so at the end of the day, that's very important. At the end of the day, there are different models of development. And if we want to preserve environment, we have to rethink development. And we cannot produce more and more. We cannot abandon or threaten the biodiversity of different seeds, so this is preserved by some local indigenous communities, and so in this way they are like an example for that. They have ways of production that should be replicated in other ways, in other parts. So at the end of the day, there is a discussion between two or more models of development.
Thank you.
So I want to share with you, we were getting some great questions in the chat, and we have one from one of our students that I would like to pose to the panel and ask if we're going to change the order this time, if I may, and say if Shailja would be the first, then Karlos, and then Antonio to wrap this up. And this question comes from Jean-Stéphane Nas, who is an MA student in applied diplomacy here at the Gray School. He asks, as climate change progresses and countries face increasing resource scarcity, how might this affect their immigration policies? Will nationalist movements and closed border policies gain popularity in response to resource scarcity? How might the international community's response to COVID-19 inform your answer? Thank you.
Great question, Jean-Stéphane. So in addition to resource scarcity, a lot of countries are also finding out that they have demographic scarcity, that they have fewer people than they thought that they had, or they had fewer skilled workers than they thought that. And so there's a labor scarcity as well. And a rational approach to that would be, to fashion immigration policy in a way which allows the circulation of people with skills and needs, or, throughout the world, in the same way as we do with capital, right? Because we're really talking about human capital. However, as you point out, states are not rational players, rational thinkers, and there's a lot of prejudice and fear of migration. And so we really need to, be much more upfront about needs and vulnerabilities of societies rather than just the needs of people who want to migrate. And I think, a country like Germany has been sort of down this path a little bit and been able to talk about its needs. But then there are other countries that just sort of whip up fear for short-term political gain. So that's what I have to say about it. I'm sorry, I don't have a lot as yet to say about COVID. So I'm going to let some of my other panelists talk about that.
Thank you so much, Shailja. Karlos?
Sorry, David, could you repeat a little bit the question? Because I thought it was for Shailja and not for me. Sorry.
No problem. So as climate change progresses and countries face increasing resource scarcity, how might this affect their immigration policies? Will nationalist movements and closed border policies gain popularity in response to resource scarcity? How might the international community's response to COVID inform your answer?
Well, there are different aspects. Well, related to scarcity, I suppose that an increasing imbalance of resources among different countries necessarily is going to improve migration. But so I suppose that this is going to be the tendency, and this is what studies say. The one, for example, of the World Bank I mentioned. But on the other hand, we are seeing more and more policies based on insular solidarity and closing borders. So I fear that this is going to be the reaction. And about the pandemic, COVID, inequalities also is one of the result of the pandemic. Different inequalities they have been triggered by the pandemic itself. But one of the most important inequalities worldwide is among the rich, the population of the rich part of the world, like myself, for example, which are vaccinated, and the vast majority or a large part of the population of the world which is not vaccinated. So we can see that the pandemic still can go on in continents like Africa or in parts of Asia, and is going to be under control in the western part of the world. So this inequality probably is going to be an additional reason to face and to avoid migrations, to stop migrations. I suspect, but well, we'll see. I think that this inequality is worrying. There is a vaccinated part of the world and other one that is not, and maybe threatening, seen as riskful in terms of public health.
Thank you so much, Karlos. And Antonio, would you like to have the last word on this question?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, I think that the question is very important because I found the global responses that is focuses on at the local as the responses of the global issues. But I found a very dangerous position with the local position about the provincialization of the world. I think it's important to move beyond. I think we need to be more critical with the local perspectives as a solutions of the global issues, because as this question is show us, for example, as Karlos says about vaccines, there is a lot of inequalities around the globe about how do we understand the free movement of the people around the globe, and not only from the south to the north. We can see how people from Haiti, people from Guatemala, people from Honduras are being rejected in countries like Mexico, like Brazil, like Argentina. How Peruvian people are rejecting in Argentina. So it's not only about the north and the south. For me, the problem is how the people understand the local. And I think that the problem, as I said before, the problem of the provincialization of the global issues. I understand that this is dangerous because at the end of the day, we found some kind of rejection in the face of the foreigner, in the face of a lot of issues that are not from my locality. So I think it's important for me, at least, to rethink this local level and how these questions show us the Basque process, or the Basque process, the global process, are showing how this inequality is progressing and it is not being more collaborative and more cooperative around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. I want to thank all three of our panelists for such a rich conversation. And we've talked about the limitations of COVID, but what a gift that that all of us can be here together in this virtual space to share this conversation and to get the perspectives of people from so many different places and disciplines. This is a tremendous gift. So Antonio Alejo in Coruña, Shailja Sharma in Chicago, and Karlos Perez in Bilbao, thank you so much. And now we're going to take another break. We're going to come back at 1:30 to panel 2, which is science diplomacy, environmental knowledge, and global public health. Until then, we look forward to seeing you in approximately 15 minutes. Bye-bye now.